Are good and evil real or relative? That's our topic for today. I've got three things up there: nuclear energy, the internet, and His Excellency the President of the United States of America. Are these things good or evil? What do you think? Is nuclear energy good or evil? Depends how it's used. Okay. What about the internet? Good or evil? You're going to say the same thing, aren't you? Depends how it's used. What about the Donald? Depends how it's used. So these seem to be examples of things that you can't really say about them they are intrinsically good or intrinsically evil. It seems relative, right? If you use nuclear energy to heal cancer and diagnose diseases and generate relatively clean energy, right, then it's a good thing. If you use nuclear energy to blow up Nagasaki and Hiroshima, then it's a very evil thing. That seems to depend on your perspective or how you approach it. The same thing with the internet. I always tell the young people what it was like before the internet to do any kind of research, and how it used to take half an hour to find something in the library. Nowadays you can, it's at your fingertips, right? I can sit here with my phone and find out whatever I want pretty much. On the other hand, it's been used to do all kinds of horrible things, spread, conspiracy theories, teach people how to make bombs and be suicide bombers, and all kinds of terrible things. Facebook, that's a whole world of evil we don't even want to get into. But again, right, it seems to depend on how you approach it. It seems to depend on who you are and what it means to you. And the same goes with Donald Trump, right? There are people who absolutely love him and adore him and think he's the best thing that's ever happened. And there are people who can't stand him and hate his guts and think he's destroying the world. Again, can we say about either of those that they are right or wrong? Is it possible to do that? That's the question that we want to address today. Is it possible to actually say, regardless of what different people think, regardless of the different opinions that people have, something can be good or something can be evil in and of itself, whatever anybody thinks about it? Now, good and evil are not just about what you think about things. Good and evil are also about what you do, how you behave, the kind of a life that you live. And so we also want to know whether certain ways of living your life are good or evil. And to help us to understand that, I'm just going to tell you briefly a little fairy tale. It's actually a story from Plato, the Greek philosopher from a long time ago. So he says there's this guy, he's a shepherd, he's a simple, poor man, and he discovers a ring. It doesn't have elvish writing on it like this. That was such a cool picture, I just had to use it. But he says, this guy discovers a ring, and in fact the guy's name is Gyges, and Gyges' ring actually doesn't look like this. It actually has, rings that have a little stone on them or something, a gem. But what Gyges discovered was very much like the ring of power from Lord of the Rings, that if he twists the ring in a particular way, he becomes invisible. Nobody can see him. Now, what would you do if you had the power of invisibility? What did Gyges do? Well, he discovered he could do all kinds of things. He could go to a banquet, become invisible, go around and collect whatever nice food he wants and walk out with it, and nobody would stop him. He could steal. It made stealing really, really easy. And so he goes on this odyssey of gradually discovering he can do more and more. Eventually he ends up killing the king and then marrying his wife and becoming king in his place. Now, was that good or evil? For Gyges, it was pretty good, wasn't it? Seems to be very good. What about the people that, the king who died, the queen who got, tricked into all of this. You'd probably say it was evil for her. So who's right and who's wrong? Is there some kind of objective way? Is there some way that doesn't depend on an individual person's own interests, what I want or what I need? Is there some way to determine whether what Gyges did was good or evil? So we're going to use him as a kind of a running example today. The other running example you might like to think about is this, a much more modern fairy tale. Let's say that you are an incredibly clever IT whiz. You're very, very good at computers. And one day you discovered that you could very easily write a little piece of code that would quickly spread throughout all the computers of the world without ever being detectable, without ever being, betraying your presence or letting people know you're there. And what this code would do is it would deduct 1 cent from every bank account in the world once a year and deposit that cent in your bank account. Is that good or evil? Right? 1 cent. Who's going to miss 1 cent a year? On the other hand, that's going to be billions of dollars for you coming in. Would that be good or evil? Okay, so think about that. Keep that in your mind. We'll come back to it a little bit later on. That was just by way of introduction. So this is the stuff I'd like to cover today. So first we're going to clarify a little further this idea of objective or subjective, good or evil. What does that mean? Secondly, we're going to, having got an idea of what that means and what people think about that, I'm going to share with you an argument from morality for the existence of God. Okay, it's not a watertight argument, but it's a very interesting argument, and I'll be interested to see what you think about it. And then finally, I'm going to look at some moral theories, some of the ways that people have kind of tried to understand good and evil, but particularly with reference to living in a good way, to acting in a good way or acting in an evil way. Let's begin with, are good and evil subjective or objective? Are good and evil real things that characterize the real world, or do they just depend on what a person thinks? So I don't think I need to define the concepts of good and evil. I think most people know what good means and what evil means. Although if we tried, I'm sure we could get ourselves tied up into knots and make things more complicated than they need to be. But for our purposes, we'll just take it as a very simple definition. What's good is what you normally think of as something is good, and what's evil is something you would normally think of something is evil. Now, the interesting thing is, the examples that I gave you earlier on would seem to suggest that the very idea of good and evil seem to imply that things must be good or evil for someone, right? So normally, if I say that nuclear energy is good, that's because nuclear energy is good for the sick people for whom nuclear isotopes can diagnose their disease and heal their cancer, right? So it's good for someone. If you didn't have anyone who was going to benefit from nuclear energy, if you didn't have anyone who was going to be harmed by nuclear energy, could you really say that in itself nuclear energy is good or evil? Think of a star, right? A star, Alpha Centauri, right? A long, long way away. As far as we know, there's no life out there, although it'd be fascinating if we ever discovered there was, but let's assume there's no life there, and nuclear fusion and stuff is going on all the time in the center of the star. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? You'd say it's neither good nor bad. Why is it neither good nor bad? It just is. Why? Because it doesn't affect anyone, right? So there seems to be this idea within good and evil that it has to be for something. Is broccoli good or evil? Now, I know this is a very contentious issue. It certainly is in our house. We have some very strong opinions that broccoli is the best thing that ever happened in the world, and some equally intense beliefs that it is the most evil thing that ever happened in the world. But once again, that seems to illustrate the point that something is good or evil for someone. Broccoli in and of itself, just growing in the ground, is neutral, right? It's neither good nor evil. That seems to be fairly straightforward. So, and good and evil, as I said earlier, are about what we ought to do. So again, there is this idea that if you do have creatures like us, creatures who are able to think and make decisions, we are required in some way to do what is good. It seems to be part of the nature of being that kind of creature, that you should try to do good, and you should try and encourage good in others, and that you should try to avoid evil, and you should try to discourage evil in others. Again, I'm not sure if that's an objective thing or not, but I'm just putting the basics down first. That seems to be the case. Which brings us to the is-ought distinction. So this is a very famous distinction from a philosopher about 300 years ago called David Hume. And he argued, and I think quite convincingly, that you can't get an ought from an is. Right? So just take broccoli, just by itself. Broccoli just is. There's nothing about ought to do with it at all, until you bring in, a person. Now, for that person, you might say, yes, we ought to eat broccoli because it's high in vitamins and, all those other good things that are supposed to be about broccoli. Or you might say, you ought not to eat broccoli because it tastes foul and it smells fouler and things like that, right? So none of those come from the broccoli itself. They come from the relationship of the person to the broccoli, if you can have a relationship with broccoli. But you understand what I'm saying, right? That's where you start to get the ought. So if I just simply describe broccoli, if I simply describe its chemical composition, its colour, its shape, things like that, that's just is. That's a description. That's what broccoli is. There's nothing good or evil there. Once I describe how it relates to a person, I like the smell, I dislike the taste, it gives me a tummy ache. Now, that's how you get ought. Because from those kinds of things, from those relationship descriptions with a person, from that you get what you ought or ought not to do. I know this sounds like possibly a strange sort of distinction to make, but it's actually a really, really important one, and I hope it'll become clearer as we go on why that distinction is important. Another example might be, it is possible to genetically manipulate a fetus, but simply because it is possible doesn't mean that we ought to manipulate the genetics of a fetus, right? To get from the is to the ought, you need to do a lot more work. You need to have other reasons and come up with other arguments to be able to do that. So this is going to become really important when we come to ask whether good and evil are just part of the world. Because usually what we describe as the world, the physical world, can be described like with science. Science describes what's there and how it behaves, and tries to find the laws that govern the way that it behaves. Could those laws end up including good and evil? Could they end up including what we ought to do and what we ought not to do? So if this distinction is right, you can't just go from the scientific description of what's there in the universe to a moral code of what we ought to do, what we should do and what we shouldn't do. Yeah.
So what if you have two ises? So, for example, we ought to eat broccoli because the state of the universe that we value is the one where people are more healthy. So now we have a destination.
Yeah.
Couldn't that give birth to an ought?
Okay, so you're saying if broccoli makes people more healthy, doesn't that mean we ought to eat broccoli? And that just came from the description, right? But why is being healthy better than not being healthy?
That's a subjective value.
That's the subjective value, yeah. Right, so to get to the ought, you had to go beyond just what is, beyond the facts of what broccoli does to a human being, and say, but I value being healthy more than not being healthy. I value that particular way of functioning of my body rather than this other way of functioning. And you know, even like in medicine, health and disease are not clear-cut distinctions. They're not like, they don't have a really clear border between them. You think about, you know, in some cultures, people with schizophrenia were treated as mystics and, you know, and witch doctors, and they were really, you know, they were at the top of the social pyramid. Why? Because the God spoke to them. And of course, it's probably not the God speaking to them, it's just, you know, they're having a hallucination or a delusion or something. But in that culture, that was considered to be the most healthy person of all. But even, you know, you will know yourself that if you go and have a blood test, like they put, you know, borders on, you know, how much your blood sugar should be. But it's not a clear border. It just, you know, sure, there are some people who, if they're really high up this way, they'll be more sick, and, you know, and there'll be some people who are in the normal range but are still not healthy and so on. So it's all sort of, you know, the whole question of what's healthy and not healthy is kind of very fuzzy in a way. And once again though, like that means that a number on a medical result sheet is neither good nor bad. We have to add stuff to it before we get to saying this is good or bad, right? You know, I'd rather my sugar be in that range because generally speaking, people in that range, you know, their organs are healthier and I want to be healthy. That's something I want. Right, none of that is there on the sheet, you know, in the, you know, 5.5 or whatever it might be. Does that sort of make sense? Yeah? All right. Now, of course, it's possible, and I'm sure, and you kind of pointed to this already, it's possible to disagree over whether a particular thing is good or evil, right? So something like abortion, okay, it's a very hot topic these days. There are people who believe very strongly that abortion should be available. It's actually a good thing in people's lives. And there are people who believe just as strongly on the other side that abortion is a very bad thing and it actually makes our society a lot worse. Now, you may think, well, what's going on here? Is it just subjective? Is that a case where it's just a matter of opinions? Perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't. If you look a little bit more deeply at those kinds of discussions that happen, you'll find that both sides share a concept of goodness as such, right? Something is good. It's just that they disagree about what to connect to that concept, right? So both the pro-life person who says abortion is evil and the pro-choice person who says abortion is good both have the same idea of the actual essence of goodness and the essence of evil. For example, they both believe if something is good, you ought to do it. Both sides agree on that. What they disagree about is what is it that is good? And that's going to come down to the details of how they think it affects people and society and individuals. What do you think is most important? Individual rights, or, you know, the culture in the society, or whatever it might be. That's not our topic for today. They interpret those kinds of details, those kind of is details about the world. They start with the same set of is details about the world, pretty much, but then they do different things with them. And that's why they come to different oughts. They come to different ideas of what's good and evil. So does this mean that this will be the case for everything that we ever ask, any question that we ever ask, any moral dilemma that we ever face? Are good and evil just in the eye of the beholder? is every moral question going to be of the same kind as the question of whether boysenberry ice cream is the best ice cream of all? And I will fight anyone who wants to disagree on that. You know I'm joking, right? Because strangely, there are people in this world who would disagree with what seems to me a very obvious fact about this world. Or are good and evil something that everybody, if they are honest seekers, should ultimately agree on, like the force of gravity, right? I can say to you, I don't believe there is such a thing as the force of gravity. And you'll disagree with me. Is that a matter of opinion? It seems that's not really a matter of opinion. No matter how much I convince myself that there is no such thing as gravity, none of you are floating up into the air, right? So that seems to be something that, you can't. But again, gravity is about the physical state of the world. It's about what is in the physical world. And that's why we're not disagreeing about it, because you can't just think about something physical and change it by thinking about it alone. So the question is morality, are good and evil like gravity, or are they like boysenberry ice cream? That's what we want to try and find out. To summarize this whole section, this is kind of what I'm saying here. So what we are calling objective good and evil, or objective moral truths, that means that things are good or evil regardless of what any creature thinks about them. So it doesn't matter what your opinion is, doesn't matter what someone else's opinion is. There is just a fact about something being good or evil. And therefore that would mean that good and evil are kind of built into the very fabric of reality, much like gravity, right? It's just part of the nature of reality. On the other hand, if you think that good and evil are subjective, then moral truths are depending upon what someone thinks about them. And sometimes that's phrased as individuals, or sometimes it's phrased as a culture or a country or a race or a religion or whatever it might be, right? So Eskimos is a famous example. Eskimos, because they live in a really harsh environment and they have very limited resources to keep the tribe alive. If they have a weak and sickly baby, they sometimes would leave the baby out in the cold and expose the baby, and the baby dies. Right? To them, that's a good thing to do, because that baby's just going to draw on a whole lot of resources. There'll be less for everybody else. The whole tribe may end up dying. So for them, that's a good thing to do. In Australia, we would say, no, that's a very evil thing to do. You should never do that. I think most people in Australia would probably say, you don't, if your child is weak and sickly, no matter how poor you are or whatever, you don't leave a child out, to die. You do whatever you can, because life is precious and valuable and so on. So a moral relativist, someone who thinks that good and evil are subjective, would actually say there is no fact of the matter here. No one can judge and say the Eskimos are wrong and the Australians are right, or vice versa. It's just subjective. It depends on the group and what they take to be good and evil. And that's what makes things good or evil. So on those two possibilities of objective and subjective, good and evil, there are kind of three positions you can take. There are three views you can hold. The first one is nihilism. So this is the idea that there is simply no such thing as objective good or evil. It's just an illusion. It's just, a byproduct of how our brains evolved, and no one can ever say about anything, this is good and this is evil, regardless of what anybody thinks. There is just no such thing. You're welcome to say, I think this is good for me, I think this is evil for me, by all means, say what you want, but that's not an intrinsic part of reality. It's not built into the fabric of the universe. And if that's the case, then as Dostoevsky said, everything is permitted. Actually, I think he said, if there is no God, everything is permitted. But that would be really the inescapable view of the nihilist. Since there is no good or evil objectively in the world, then there is nothing that I ought or ought not to do. so therefore I can do anything. Okay, now sure, some things if I do them, I'll get hurt, and maybe that's why I won't do them. But you can't say that that thing is evil, right? So punching someone in the face, the only reason I might refrain from doing that is because they'll punch me back. But the act of punching them is not evil in itself. And it's not good in itself. It just is, right? So this is nihilism. Now, you can see that a lot of people will be very uncomfortable about this, regardless of what you think about God or anything. So moral relativism is a way to avoid this. Moral relativism is the idea that there is good and evil, but it's only culturally or personally relative. So what's good for me need not be good for you. What's good for you need not be good for me. You follow your moral code, I'll follow my moral code, and let's all just get along together, which is a lovely sentiment, right? Let's not fight about it. That's very nice. Let's all be friendly, and we do that in many other things. We don't ever really fight over broccoli. We don't fight over boysenberry ice cream. We just say, sure, if you like broccoli, with pleasure and healing. So that's a relativistic approach to broccoli. So some people would say, many people do say, that we ought to take the same approach to good and evil. We're not going to say there's no such thing as good and evil at all. We're just going to say that everybody makes their own moral code, whether individually or as a group in some way, and they should, they ought to follow that moral code. So now we've got to the ought, right? The nihilist has no ought. There's nothing you ought to do. But the moral relativist says, no, there is something you ought to do. You ought to obey your moral code, the one under which you live, wherever that derives from. But that ought only applies to the people under that moral code. You can't apply it to other people who have a different moral code, right? So the Hindu, the devout Hindu, ought not to eat beef because cows are sacred and so on. But the devout Hindu has no right to say to the American, you can't eat your Big Mac or whatever. And the American ought to eat his Big Mac because that's what he likes, but he has no right to say to the Hindu, you ought to eat beef. Everybody just live your life and get along. Now, the third possibility is that there is an objective good and evil that doesn't depend on what any person thinks about it. And those kinds of oughts, those kinds of moral truths, apply to everyone regardless of what they think, regardless of what their personal or their cultural moral code might be. So, for example, you might say that if moral realism is true and if killing babies or allowing babies to die is objectively evil, then we can say that it is wrong for the Eskimos to leave their babies out to die. Even though that's their moral code, even though that's what they've been doing all this time, it is objectively wrong to do that. And that's not just because we say it, that's because everywhere at all times it's objectively wrong. A point I need to clarify here, and just to make sort of a little important point. To be a moral realist, to think that there are objective goods and evils, doesn't mean that you think that everything we call good is objectively good or everything we call evil is objectively evil, right? Basically, generally what you would be saying is that there are some basic things that we can call good and evil, basic principles. But then how you combine those principles, how you put them together, may make any specific instance, event or action good or evil, depending on the circumstances, right? So for example, in the Coptic Church's view of abortion, the Church says that abortion is wrong, except in the case where the life of the mother or the life of the child is seriously in peril, in which case it's better, rather than letting two people die, the baby and the mother, it's better to have the abortion, only one person dies, the baby, and the other person gets to live, right? So the basic principle there is we should preserve life as far as we can, right? That's sort of taken to be the objective moral truth. But when it comes to the specific action of performing an abortion, there is another principle, which is if it's a choice between 1 and 2 lives, then it's better to minimize the harm and so on. So that actually makes an action that would have seemed wrong in this case, in this very specific case, to therefore be right, if that kind of makes sense.